Hello and welcome to the Rodgers Brief. I'm Adam Rodgers and I'm going to be reading today further from my ebook, Deficits of Trust, which is a report on the events of the mass casualty of April 18th and 19th, 2020 in Portapique and other areas of central Nova Scotia, and also dealing with the Mass Casualty Commission itself, the Commission of Inquiry which examined those events. So I'm going to start with part 2, section 7, and I'm going to cover sections 7 through 10 in this reading. Covered sections I think up till section 6 in the last version, which I recorded last week. So this is going to be section 7, Revelations at Dawn, Still No Warnings. Once Lisa Banfield emerged from hiding at 6:30 a.m. Sunday, things began to change. Miss Banfield told police Wortman had loaded his replica RCMP cruiser with at least 5 lethal weapons and was preparing to head to Dartmouth to burn down his denturist business and kill her sister, Maureen. Until that point, RCMP at the command post in Great Village believed they had accounted for all the vehicles owned by the killer. By 7:17 a.m., photos of the replica car and the suspect were provided by Banfield's family to the Halifax Regional Police, who broadcast them on their own channel. Around this same time, Wortman was back on the road, leaving Debert and heading west. The first victims on April 19, 2020, Alana Jenkins and Sean McLeod, were known to the killer and both worked at the Spring Hill Institution. Certainly, one would presume that had an alert been issued, they would have taken some evasive action upon seeing an RCMP vehicle pulling into their yard. The killer spent 3 hours at the Jenkins-McLeod home, which may mean that he was searching the home for something specific. He left with Mr. McLeod's wallet and his jacket from Spring Hill, though it is unclear what he may have been intending to do with either item. Most likely he was thinking they could be used as a disguise in case he was spotted or confronted. There is speculation that Wortman may have left the home during these 3 hours and gone to Pictou, where witnesses say he traveled a month earlier in an attempt to find an individual named Kip Mackenzie. Wortman evidently thought that Mr. Mackenzie had unfairly gained ownership of a property in Fredericton that Wortman himself thought would be coming to him. This is all connected to the estate of former lawyer Tom Evans, through which Wortman gained a significant portion of his wealth. Given the short amounts of time that Wortman seemed to spend at every other scene, it makes some sense to conclude that he only spent a short time at the Jenkins-McLeod home. The MCC has not presented any evidence of home or business video surveillance cameras on the route from this location to Pictou along the northern route, so it has not been ruled out. On the other hand, Wortman did not seem to have any other targeted killings in the Wentworth area. So if his plan, after killing Jenkins and McLeod, was to start making his way to Dartmouth, then he would likely have known that he could more easily avoid detection doing so from Pictou rather than returning to their home. Tom Bagley, a volunteer firefighter, went over to the Jenkins-McLeod home when he saw the fire and unfortunately encountered the killer and was himself shot and killed. Again, had there been an emergency alert issued, Mr. Bagley would almost certainly have taken other actions and likely still be alive. Neighbors of Miss Jenkins and Mr. McLeod, the McBurneys, had information which, had they known there was an active shooter disguised as an RCMP officer, would have been helpful in stopping him. The McBurneys knew the Blairs, had been speaking with their son on the morning of the 19th, and so not only knew that they had been killed, but also the name of the killer. They also knew that the killer was acquainted with Jenkins-McLeod, and so attempted to reach Sean McLeod by text. When he did not respond, they called the RCMP and were told that there was nobody available or nearby. Very shortly thereafter, however, they saw the killer in his replica RCMP vehicle drive by. Had the public been alerted to the replica vehicle, the McBurneys would have known how important and timely this observation had been. At 8:02 a.m., 911 dispatcher Lisa Stewart told someone at the Tantallon Dispatch Center the full name of the killer and that he may possibly be using a fully marked Ford Taurus. She also identified the car number as being 28B11, that it had lights, that Wortman was arrestable for homicide with a, quote, possible count of 8, close quote. 4 minutes later, the RCMP Staff Sergeant Bruce Briers told Sergeant Wayne Sutherland that the killer was probably out of that area, referring to Portapique. At about the same time, dispatcher Brittany Houghton told an officer at the Cobequid Pass toll plaza that, quote, he could be anywhere in the province and he is obviously very armed and dangerous, close quote. Upon receiving the car photos from Maureen Banfield, Halifax police immediately forwarded both photographs by email to RCMP Staff Sergeant Addie McCallum, who was working out of the command post in Great Village. He had them by 7:27 a.m. By 8:05 a.m., every RCMP officer and police force in Nova Scotia had access to a photo of that replica police car through a police database called PROS. The RCMP also issued a Be on the Lookout, or BOLO, describing the car and the suspect, warning that the gunman was armed and dangerous and arrestable for multiple homicides. It was before 8 a.m. when Staff Sergeant Steve Halliday tasked his colleague Addie McCallum to work with RCMP communications officers to get the photos of the car and the suspect out to the public and to border officials ASAP. At 7:45 a.m., Staff Sergeant McCallum talked with communications officer Leah Scanlon about asking the public to watch for this car and to call 911 if you see it. Just before that, at 7:43 a.m., Chief Superintendent Leather made a rather cryptic suggestion to Ms. Scanlon about the content of the proposed media release. Quote, specific info that the perp is alive, get to the people in the area, picture and name, not there right now, close quote. There was more back and forth between various RCMP officers about whether to publicly release the photograph of the replica car. At 8:16 a.m., Staff Sergeant Briers, risk manager of the OCC, sent out a message to all members that they were looking for, quote, potentially a white fully marked PC 28 Bravo 11. Please wear your hard body armor for the rest of your duration of your shift today, just in the event you come across this vehicle, close quote. None of that information was released to the public. About 35 minutes later, Tom Bagley left his Hunter Road house for his morning walk. He came across the burning home of Alana Jenkins and Sean McLeod and went to help. He was shot dead by Wortman just outside the home. At 8:45 a.m., Constable Heidi Stevenson asked Staff Sergeant Briers if the photo could be released publicly. Staff Sergeant Briers was the risk manager who took over from Staff Sergeant Rahal on the morning of April 19, 2020. He was not in charge of the overall police response. That responsibility would lie with Critical Incident Commander Staff Sergeant West. Staff Sergeant Briers was there to ensure appropriate resources were in place or requested as needed. He was also coordinating with other police agencies to obtain and provide information, such as the photo of the car that the RCMP received. Staff Sergeant Briers testified that he had received word from dispatch that Constable Heidi Stevenson had asked whether consideration was given to a public warning. Staff Sergeant Briers testified that this was not a decision he could make, but that he passed the idea up the chain to others. He tried to reach Staff Sergeant McCallum, then spoke with Staff Sergeant Carroll. Staff Sergeant Carroll was in his car and not physically present at the command post in Great Village. Staff Sergeant Carroll sent an email to Staff Sergeant Briers at 9:09 a.m. saying the matter has been discussed and a decision has been made not to release the photo of the vehicle at this time. Staff Sergeant Briers was emotional when thinking about Constable Stevenson. He also broke down later when asked in cross-examination about information regarding the push bar on the mock cruiser. Staff Sergeant Briers said he did not hear that on the radio at the time, but has since read the transcript and now says he has to live every day with the knowledge that missed, overlooked information like that could have made such a difference. It was difficult for Staff Sergeant Briers to get through that part of his testimony, but he did. It took some courage, but I suspect those moments helped him process his guilt and his memories. It was also important for people to see him struggle. It is all very human. The other senior officers who avoided difficult questions rather than face them head on may look to the experience of Staff Sergeant Briers with a tinge of regret. Communications analysis paralysis, second escape, and 2 more dead. At 9:05 a.m., RCMP Communications Officer Leah Scanlon asked Corporal Jennifer Clark for help preparing a media release about the replica RCMP car. Ms. Scanlon had been given the green light by Staff Sergeant McCallum before 8 a.m., but the plan was to issue the tweet with the photo of the suspect first. That tweet went out at 8:54 a.m. Corporal Clark started to prepare the tweet and Facebook post with information about the replica police car, including the fake call number. When she couldn't reach Staff Sergeant McCallum at 9:40 a.m. to approve the final version, she emailed Staff Sergeant Halliday. Staff Sergeant Halliday approved the tweet, including the photo of the car, for immediate release to the public. That was at 9:45 a.m., only a few minutes after RCMP learned Lillian Campbell had been shot in Wentworth, and the killer was, again, an active threat to the public. The tweet with the photograph of the replica police cruiser was issued by the RCMP at 10:17 a.m. and posted to Facebook a few minutes later. It took more than an hour and a half, but a draft tweet with a photo of the car was written. At 9:40 a.m., the tweet's author, Corporal Clark, sent the wording of the draft tweet to Staff Sergeant McCallum, her liaison in the field, for approval, but just then, and the timestamp on the radio dispatch is 9:41 a.m., Staff Sergeant McCallum was pulled away to respond to a new murder in Wentworth. Lillian Campbell had been shot dead by someone driving what looked like an RCMP cruiser. The MCC presented a foundational document focused on Miss Campbell and how she was killed by Gabriel Wortman while out for her morning walk. The evidence suggests that the killer saw her walking, did a U-turn, and went to speak with her. He shot her from inside his replica RCMP vehicle. It would seem he was concerned he may have been known to be driving an RCMP replica, and so felt he needed to eliminate any witnesses. Again, had there been an emergency alert issued, it is highly unlikely that Miss Campbell would have taken her morning walk, and so she would still likely be alive today. After killing Miss Campbell, Wortman proceeded south on Highway 4, which would have eventually led him back to the Trans-Canada Highway in Masstown. At 9:47 a.m., Corporal Rodney Peterson met the killer's mock RCMP vehicle while Corporal Peterson was traveling north on Highway 4. He immediately radioed that he thought he had encountered the perpetrator. Unfortunately, Corporal Peterson did not immediately turn his vehicle around to follow the killer, but rather waited until he felt he had a safe spot to make a U-turn, which turned out to be 1.2 kilometers beyond the meeting point. By the time he turned around to pursue the killer, he was out of sight. The Commission will have to confront the difficult issue of how aggressive police should be in active shooter situations. This meeting is one of several examples where it appears that more aggressive action would have been appropriate. Corporal Peterson stated that he was worried that if he turned around right away, he would have been vulnerable to an attack by Wortman. Being aggressive is dangerous, of course, but police are supposed to protect citizens from danger, and so the Commission will need to think about what an appropriate level of personal risk for a police officer might be. Corporal Peterson continued to drive south towards the Trans-Canada Highway, hoping to catch up. Meanwhile, Wortman had turned into the driveway of Adam and Carol Fisher, a couple who were known to him, though not well. Wortman had asked Mr. Fisher to give him a quote on an excavating job some years prior, and he had been to their home before. Wortman drove up the driveway, parked his mock cruiser where it could not be seen from the road, and with gun in hand knocked on the Fishers' door. The Fishers did not answer the door, and in fact, each of them had called 911 to alert the police of the killer's presence. Adam Fisher had actually also called 911 earlier when he found out the name of the killer to let the police know about the vehicles owned by Wortman. The killer had told Fisher about his plans to assemble a mock RCMP vehicle some years earlier. Unfortunately, because they were hiding out of sight in their home, the Fishers were not able to advise 911 that the killer had left after just over 2 minutes in their yard. It would seem that the killer had only gone into this familiar location to elude Corporal Peterson, as when he left he went north rather than following Corporal Peterson's route south. There was no evidence that Wortman had tried to enter this home, and no evidence that he might have been aware that Adam Fisher had a gun, with which he was ready to defend himself. There was a closing submission from the Canadian Firearms Association to the effect that the Fishers were the only ones to survive an encounter with Wortman in their home, and that this could be credited to the presence of a firearm. While some may find that to be compelling in theory, the facts here do not quite support the submission. Believing the killer was still at the Fisher residence, approximately 40 officers, including the ERT members, staged at the highway near the residence and slowly made their way through the woods and up the driveway. Staff Sergeant McCallum later testified that this moment was one he regrets, as he felt that a more aggressive approach to the Fisher residence would have been an opportunity to capture Wortman. Staff Sergeant McCallum remains very bothered and became emotional discussing this key moment in the pursuit of the killer, when he was reported to be at the home of the Fishers. Staff Sergeant McCallum knew the location and drove there with Constable Hubley. Unfortunately, the RCMP convoy stopped to stage about 2 kilometers from the site. Staff Sergeant McCallum got out of his vehicle and urged the members to continue on, but now knows that those precious minutes may have cost him a sighting of the killer as he left the Fishers going north. Compare, however, that instinct to be aggressive in pursuit of the killer that Staff Sergeant McCallum displayed to the instructions given by Sergeant O'Brien and implicitly supported by other supervisors on the radio the night before to not send a second IR team into Portapique, and to instruct the first IR team to pull back and shelter in place. Staff Sergeant McCallum was the commanding officer in Guysborough during the Desmond family tragedy in January 2017 and testified at that inquiry. His involvement and his leadership at that time was rightly and widely praised. Staff Sergeant McCallum was open about mistakes he thought were made with the RCMP response, in particular the failures in technology at the Bible Hill detachment and the failure for key pieces of information to reach the command level. In particular, he noted that had the mapping software Pictometry been available, he would have immediately noticed the road coming out of Portapique by the Blueberry Field. The police at this point seemed entirely focused on the Fishers' residence as the one possible location of the killer and did not make any effort to block off surrounding roads such as Plains Road. This road goes through Debert, and surveillance video from several businesses in the community showed the killer driving his marked police cruiser east through Debert. Wortman was not driving unusually fast, and witnesses in vehicles that were driving either in front or behind him did not have any sense that it was anything other than a regular police car. Corporal Clark quickly became aware that Staff Sergeant McCallum was on the Campbell call, so she emailed Staff Sergeant Halliday at 9:45 a.m. for his approval. Staff Sergeant Halliday approved the tweet, but then Corporal Clark emailed her boss, Ms. Scanlon, to get her approval as well. The subject line of the email read, quote, "Approved by Steve Halliday, tweet for approval, immediate please, 22B11 description," close quote. The body of the email read, "Please note they are responding to another incident, suspect is on the run, tweet is approved, Jen." Ms. Scanlon did not respond, and so there that draft tweet sat, unsent, on Corporal Clark's computer. Corporal Clark told the Mass Casualty Commission that it was the longest 27 minutes of her life. Ms. Scanlon said that when Ms. Clark emailed asking for her approval, she was juggling 2 phones and involved in multiple conversations with Chief Superintendent Leather and others. This is another key point, where better decision-making could have saved lives. Corporal Clark knew there was a killer on the loose and in fact had just killed Lillian Campbell while he was driving a fake police car. She knew the public was at tremendous risk. She had the photo of the fake car, had taken care in drafting an accurate tweet to alert the public, but then hesitated rather than taking independent action. During those 27 minutes, community care assistant Kristen Beaton, who was pregnant at the time, was driving between appointments. Earlier in the morning, she had been occasionally checking her phone, speaking and texting with her husband, Nick Beaton, about events in Portapique the night before. Nick was watching social media and updating Ms. Beaton about the search for the killer. At 9:37 a.m., Nick Beaton forwarded his wife an RCMP Facebook post that named and described the killer. Their last conversation was a 2-minute call that began at 9:41 a.m. Just before 10 a.m., Miss Beaton was on Plains Road. She had pulled over to check her phone and text with her husband when the killer pulled over next to her, went to her window, and shot her. Some passers-by witnessed the interaction, though not the actual shooting. Also during those 27 minutes, Heather O'Brien, a nurse, was out on a drive. Earlier in the morning, she had learned that someone she was close to was murdered in Portapique. She needed to clear her head and was in the habit during this early stage of the pandemic of visiting her adult daughters and their families, who both live in the Masstown area, on Sunday mornings. Throughout the morning, Miss O'Brien had been on the phone with her colleague Leona Allen 6 times, talking about Portapique and their work duties. At 9:37 a.m., Miss O'Brien texted Miss Allen a photo of the suspected killer. Miss Allen called Miss O'Brien a 7th time at 9:59:49 a.m. Miss O'Brien told her that she had pulled to the side of the road on Plains Road. She heard gunshots, probably the nearby murder of Kristen Beaton. Then Miss O'Brien saw a police officer approaching her. Miss Allen heard Miss O'Brien scream, then 3 gunshots. The call lasted 35 seconds. Heather O'Brien was dead. 911 calls alerted police that these further killings had taken place, and therefore the police knew to leave the Fisher residence. The killer drove south on McCallum Road back towards Highway 2/4 between Portapique and Truro, and headed east on Highway 2/4, passing the Onslow Fire Hall some minutes later. Neither alert nor quite ready. Darcy Dobson is the daughter of Heather O'Brien. Like many other family members of victims, she had hoped to testify during the MCC proceedings, but was not invited to do so. Miss Dobson and Nick Beaton have described to members of the media how things would have unfolded much differently that morning had there been an alert sent out to members of the public on their phones, as is possible with the Alert Ready system. The failure to do so was identified immediately as an issue and is considered a major failure of the response to the shootings. The Alert Ready system was unveiled in April 2018 by the federal government. There were 2 tests of the system in Nova Scotia in 2018, as announced by the Provincial Emergency Measures Office. The alerts can be sent to any mobile phone in a certain geographical area, and when they are received, they are very difficult to miss or ignore. Instead of emergency alerts, however, all that was provided to the public while the shooter was still active were tweets from the Nova Scotia RCMP Twitter account. Ms. Scanlon spoke about the decision to use Twitter and social media generally as a way to convey information to the public during a critical incident. She said that after the Moncton RCMP shootings, this was the recommended way to do so, and she herself was the author of part of the report emerging from that earlier shooting, which dealt with public communications. Despite this recommendation, it emerged in her evidence that Ms. Scanlon is not a Twitter user personally, and did not seem to have a clear understanding of how best to use the platform. The RCMP posts were inconsistent in their use of hashtags and did not thread the information. So in addition to not being timely or having appropriate content, the tweets were also disjointedly laid out. Why the RCMP didn't issue a noisy public alert over cell phones and radio to warn the public the killer was on the run in a replica police vehicle was a question that was asked almost immediately. The short answer, as evidenced by statements from RCMP personnel in decision-making roles, is that those in charge were unaware of its existence. Like many others, Critical Incident Commander Jeff West said it was, quote, wasn't a tool in our toolbox, close quote. The Alert Ready system is operated by the Provincial Emergency Management Office, which had for years tried unsuccessfully to interest the RCMP and municipal police forces to use it for more than Amber alerts involving lost or kidnapped children. In 2016, the RCMP and other forces turned down an offer to learn to operate the system and said it would continue to make requests through EMO on a case-by-case basis. Inspector Dustine Rodier, who was in charge of the RCMP Emergency Management Unit created following the Swiss Air disaster, had attended meetings with EMO occasionally, but her main focus was on establishing a new 911 Operations Communications Center in Dartmouth to replace the one in Truro the inspector supervised. On Sunday, April 19, 2020, managers with EMO heard about multiple shootings in Portapique and called in staff and set up their Alert Ready system in anticipation of a call from the RCMP should they want to issue a public message. That call never came. I was following the RCMP Twitter account and saw their tweets that morning, but I do not know anyone else among my friends and associates around my part of Guysborough who do, and the same seems to apply to the Colchester area. Global News noted that Statistics Canada says that there are approximately 22,000 homes in Colchester County, of which likely 87% or 19,000 would have had mobile phones that could receive an emergency alert. This issue was the subject of wide reporting at the time, and so perhaps people presume it has been addressed and there is nothing more to review. That is not the case at all. There is still no legislation, regulations, or publicly available protocol documents describing how Alert Ready should be used or which break down responsibilities in an active shooter situation. The Alert Ready website still does not even mention active shooter among the many instances where the system should be engaged. The MCC heard from an international expert on public safety on how such alerts are used in Australia and the UK. Michael Hallows is currently a private consultant on public alerts who led the development of the emergency alert system in Australia after a career as a police officer in England. He testified that his efforts to advise Canadian governments on emergency alert system developments and his views on the quality of our public alert system. He was also able to draw on examples in Norway and Iceland during his remarks. Mr. Hallows was quite critical of the Canadian model as it was designed and as it operates, and provided valuable insight into how a better system might be built. First of all, he described how the Canadian system being built and owned by a private company was unique and problematic. It seems to have resulted in a situation where only phones linked to a 4G network, which means newer versions of phones and excludes up to 65% of users, are able to receive alerts. In Australia, they mandated that phones that can connect to anything 3G and better would receive the alerts, which thereby includes 95% of cell phones. The very important concept of subsidiarity was discussed by Mr. Hallows as well. This means that the lowest possible ranking frontline responder should have the ability and authority to issue an alert or direct that an alert be issued. This would have meant that Constable Stuart Basselt would have had the authority to issue an emergency alert shortly after 11 p.m. on April 18, 2020, when it occurred to him to mention it on the police radio. Mr. Hallows has worked with governments to work the response time, that is the time between the decision to issue an alert and the alert going out, to 8 minutes. The response time is incredibly important, which is why you need to delegate authority down as low as possible. He said that timeliness is more important than perfect accuracy, and that so long as incorrect information is corrected, people will trust the system and act responsibly when notified of an emergency. The RCMP say they have instituted a new emergency alert policy, and they have put that into use in the recent stabbing rampage in Saskatchewan, where an alert was issued an hour and a half after the first 911 call. There is, however, still every reason to conduct a detailed examination of the emergency alert system in Nova Scotia so that we have clear protocols and assigned responsibilities. The new RCMP policy still restricts who can receive an alert, who can issue an alert, keeping that authority in the hands of commanding officers who may be too distant from the action on the ground to have an accurate sense of the severity of whatever may be taking place. When every second counts, time cannot be wasted trying to sort out who is in charge or what justifies an alert. People died because the system did not work when it was needed. Plain road and plain language. Plains Road and Plain Language. Constable Ian Fahey testified about the death of Heather O'Brien on Plains Road. Constable Fahey had been stationed in Antigonish some years ago, though I do not remember him well. His testimony was difficult, as he had, by his own admission, some poor choices of words in his earlier statement when he needed to explain. But overall, I think his testimony helped his own personal credibility. and is another example of the mistaken view of the National Police Federation that no officers should have testified. Constable Fahey certainly held up under questioning and came off much more competently than he did from a bare or narrow reading of his statement. Constable Fahey and his partner, Constable Devonna Coleman, were the first on the scene of the shooting death of Miss O'Brien. Constable Fahey thought he felt a pulse on her, but was then quickly relieved by Corporal Dwayne Ivany, who was a medically trained officer. Corporal Ivany took over the treatment of Miss O'Brien from Constable Fahey. Corporal Ivany and Constable Fahey's evidence conflicts as to whether Miss O'Brien's driver's door was able to be opened. Constable Fahey said he checked Miss O'Brien through the driver's side door, while Corporal Ivany said they had to bust open the door in order to access her, and that he was the first to treat her. Corporal Ivany spoke at length about his qualifications and experience, which seemed extensive, yet he improperly, at first, took Miss O'Brien's pulse with his thumb, not his fingers. He and his partner did subsequent checks and were confident that she was deceased at that time. During his testimony, Constable Fahey had to explain why he said in his statement that Miss O'Brien was barely alive, and later that the police had to let her die. These words, coupled with the Fitbit data that the family provided to the MCC, led to questions as to when Miss O'Brien actually died. Constable Fahey says she was in the course of dying and he did not think she could be saved, and he may have wanted to feel a pulse. Adding to the difficulty was the fact that EHS personnel were told to stay away from the scene, as the officers were unsure as to whether Wortman may still be in the area, and it was deemed unsafe for an ambulance to get too close. Therefore, it was only Constable Fahey and Corporal Ivany who had a chance to perform any medical treatment or observe Miss O'Brien's condition. The Fitbit being worn by Miss O'Brien continued to generate heart rate data for another 8 hours after police determined that she had died. This data was seemingly ignored by the MCC at first, which led the O'Brien family to release the details in a public Facebook post after the proceedings had ended for the day, when her death was discussed. They said they had provided the data, but were given no explanation for why it was seemingly not used or analyzed in any way. Eventually, the MCC brought in Nova Scotia Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Matthew Bowes to explain that there may have been some electrical impulses emanating from Miss O'Brien's body, but that she was most certainly dead within seconds of being shot. This all must have been very difficult evidence for the family to hear, but this additional heartache would have been completely unnecessary but for the MCC's trauma-informed approach to evidence. Corporal Ivany seemed to mention inadvertently what would seem to be a key detail, that Miss O'Brien was shot in the eye by the killer. Nobody wants to talk about gruesome details, but in this case, the MCC's trauma-informed institutional effort to avoid speaking plainly seems to have led to a great deal of unhelpful speculation. Another interesting note from Constable Fahey's testimony was that he and Constable Coleman were traveling together through Debert just before they arrived at the scene and had a discussion about what they would do if they encountered the killer driving his replica cruiser. They decided that Constable Fahey would ram the car and Constable Coleman would start shooting through the windshield at the killer. This was interesting, not so much for the plan itself, which was a good and brave plan, but rather in comparison to the later evidence of Constables Brown and Melanson, the officers who shot up the Onslow Belmont Fire Hall, who essentially denied having any conversation with each other about the situation unfolding around them. Certainly, it would be more natural to expect that there would be significant conversations going on throughout this time. Not knowing where exactly the killer may have been, one may have expected that supervisors would have deployed the many officers available to various locations to block off roads in the area. One may also have expected the officers to be more aggressive at this stage of the situation, knowing that the killer was still active and extremely dangerous to all members of the public. Okay, so that's sections 7 through 10 of part 2. We'll continue on with the Onslow Belmont Fire Hall situation and proceeding further onward in the next session. Thanks again for everybody for listening. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.